we've already been discussing the topic of the destruction of languages throughout the conference. And I was really struck yesterday when Elder Wendy was telling us about her great uncle who knew 30 languages, and then he was brutally beaten and lost his memory and lost all the languages. And with the loss of the language, the entire world was gone. The entire way of being was gone. So I would like to invite our panelists today to speak about their experiences of losing the languages, but also, as we heard throughout the conference in this room, we've already heard very many languages. So I would also like to invite you to speak about this resurgence and revitalization. I will begin with introducing you briefly. We have joining us on Zoom, Aluki Kotierk, who is president of Nunavut, Tunngavik. And Aluki worked for various Inuit organizations and is a strong advocate for Inuktitut language, a driving force in the move to see the language recognized by the federal government. And currently, Aluki Kotierk is a co-chair of the Global Task Force for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And we also have with us Lorena Fontaine. Lorena Fontaine already introduced herself yesterday, but I will just say very quickly that Lorena is Cree Anishinaabe from Saging First Nation in Manitoba and a professor at the University of Winnipeg, co-director of an Indigenous Languages program. Lorena has also been an advocate for Indigenous residential school survivors and their descendants, working as a legal consultant on behalf of the survivors. Our third speaker is Dr. Stanley Rodriguez, who has been president of Kumeyaay Community College since 2018. He also serves as a council member of the Santa Ysabel Band of the Iipay Nation. And he is also currently Kumeyaay language instructor at Kumeyaay Community College, and has been very involved in the resurgence and revitalization of his language. So perhaps you will be so kind as to tell us about the experiences of the destruction of languages in your family, in your community. And perhaps could we ask Aluki Kotierk to begin. I apologize for the technical difficulties. We will push against them.
Kuyan namig ilaw kataw yung nakamatamani kiseni mamepunga kakasaw yak ko ilaw gama. First, I just want to thank you, Lorena, for inviting me to participate at this conference. I was really looking forward to being there in person. So I apologize that I'm joining by Zoom, but I am very grateful that the technology exists so that I am still able to participate. In terms of the destruction of Inuktitut, first I thought I would tell two stories, illustrative stories. First, in 2016, I'm the oldest of 7 children. So in 2016, my family, my parents and my 6 siblings and I and our children traveled by boat. I think there were 4 boats, and we had 6 tents we traveled to where my father grew up as a child. For those of you who might not be aware, Inuit in the between 1940s and 1960s were moved from the land into settlements, into communities. So my father had moved to a community, and I had grown up with him always homesick. And I didn't truly understand what he meant when he would, as an adult, cry and talk about how he was homesick. And so it's only when I became an adult I realized the colonial approaches that had taken place in our homelands that had our people move from the land to communities. And so because he had always been homesick, one day he had made a comment that he was homesick, and in that instance I was in front of a laptop, so it worked out really well. I said, what time of year would be good, when should we go? And so we planned, and all my siblings from different parts of Canada, we all traveled to my home community of Igloolik, and from there we took off and spent several weeks where my father grew up. And it was both healing, in the sense that he was able to show us where the sod houses were, where he had grown up, but also very much full of pain, because he, along with some of his siblings who had traveled with us, were reminiscing about their childhood and talking about the pain of no longer living there. And I think there was a pivotal moment for me there, because I'm the eldest and I speak Inuktitut, and my father speaks Inuktitut. And one day while we were there, he was saying we were going to walk to look at the kangmaks, the sod houses, where he and family members had lived. And so we were all getting ready. And then he yelled over to me and said, Aluki, Aluki, Kaigit, Aluki, well, come over here. And I was getting one of my children kind of ready, but I went over and he said to me, I want you to be close to me. I want you to be my interpreter. And then under his breath, very quietly, he said, to my own children. And in that instance, I felt like the world needed to pause. I felt like if I had a big red button to press the stop button, I would press it and say, hey, wait a minute. What do you mean a parent has to use an interpreter to speak to their own child? And I think that has driven me ever since to talk about Inuit language, Inuktitut, and the importance of making sure that we continue to support our language through resources, through proactive efforts, because it will no longer thrive very quickly in very short order if we continue to let it be the way it is. And the thing is that I know my siblings, all of us, spoke Inuktitut. And so I know it happens in a very short period of time. That's one circumstance I wanted to share. The other one, if I have time, is that in my territory, there are many Inuit who don't speak any other language other than Inuktitut. This is fine if essential public services were available in Inuktitut, but the reality is that in Canada, the two officially recognized languages of Canada are French and English. So the expectation is that governments provide services in French and English. And so Inuit who have never left, who have been born and will live and will die in the same territory that they continue to live in, oftentimes, are placed in a circumstance where they're depending on grandchildren, on nieces and nephews, to provide informal interpretation because their grandchildren are bilingual in both Inuktitut and English. And so, as a person who's currently in a public office as an elected official, I often have the opportunity to speak to Canadian federal ministers, including the Prime Minister. I appear in front of standing committee. And when you think about it, and you know that I grew up, my childhood was in a community of less than 1,200 people, and I was super shy. You think about the amount of courage and bravery it takes a person like me to have to be advocating for something so important. And so there have been many circumstances where I've had to dig really deep to try and have the courage to speak up. And often because I'm a part of the community, often I would envision a person close to me that I love, that I know cannot advocate for themselves. And so I often would envision my unilingual Inuktitut speaking eldest aunt when I was going to meet in front of the Prime Minister, or when I was going to speak with the Minister of Languages. And I would think I need to be articulate and clear about what I expect this government to proceed with for the sake of my aunt. And then just prior to having a meeting with the Prime Minister, the week of April 18th this year, my eldest aunt passed away. And so there was a moment where it felt for me, well, what is the point? I failed. All the years of advocating to get essential public services in Inuktitut is for nothing, because the person I was working hard for, the person I was trying so hard to be courageous for, has now died without the dignity of expecting and being able to expect essential public services in our own territory. And then a few days later, there was a meeting with the Prime Minister. And although I'm known to advocate for language, I was quiet for a while because I was like, I don't know what to say. What is the point? What is the point of all this madness? Where I have to continually say, we need and expect public essential services in Inuktitut. And I mean, it's taken me some time. I'm now at a point where I feel like I can continue to advocate. And there are other people in our community, in our territory, that find themselves in the same circumstance. And the reality is, whether a person is bilingual in Inuktitut and English, each of us have the right to determine whether or not we want to be serviced in Inuktitut. And that in itself is worth continuing to advocate for. So those are the two stories I thought I would share just to provide the context of what drives me personally, but also to kind of capture and illustrate or provide a window of how many of us continue to live with our language in our communities. Thank you.
So courageously for us, telling us about the struggle every day, and thinking, as you said so many times, of being on the verge of giving up, but never giving up. So thank you very much. And perhaps I will now ask Lorena if you would like to share your Aluki background.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay? So like Aluki, I'm going to share a personal, a pivotal point in my life, and then how that led into the work that I do for advocating for Indigenous language rights. So my territory is quite a ways from Luki's territory, where Inuktitut is the majority language, and down where I'm from, our languages are endangered. So we don't hear our languages in our community. It is not the language that the majority of us speak. We primarily speak in English. For me, growing up, both my parents are fluent. So my dad was fluent in Ojibwe, and my mother, or Anishinaabe, Muin. My mother is fluent in Cree, and my grandparents only spoke Cree and Ojibwe. They didn't speak any English. Both my grandparents and my parents attended residential school. My grandparents resisted. They were made to speak English in the schools, but when they left, they refused to ever speak English again. Even to the point when the grandchildren, my generation, would go and visit, my mom and aunts would translate what my grandparents would be talking about. And to me, that I grew up thinking that that was normal. And when I left graduate school, when I was doing my master's at the University of Arizona, I came back to Canada, and there were thousands of claims, residential school claims, against the federal government and the churches for the physical, spiritual, and cultural abuse that Indigenous peoples experienced. And I started working on those claims as a lawyer. And I went across the country talking to Aboriginal people about what they wanted their claims to be about. And I'd say 99% of them said, we are losing our language and culture. Our children no longer speak the language, and they don't know who they are anymore. And it was the first time that I had heard the term genocide, because that's how they articulated it. They said that the federal government wanted to destroy our distinctiveness in those schools. They took our land, and now they're taking away our language and culture. They wanted to eradicate anything that would be a marker of distinctiveness for Aboriginal people. And they knew that the language transmission happened with the children. So those schools were designed to eradicate the distinctiveness of our communities. And when I was working on those claims and I heard this, I started reflecting on my family relationship with the language. And what I recognized for the first time was that translation that was happening between my grandparents, between the aunts and uncles and my mother, was not normal. It was not normal. And I started digging deep. I wanted to find out, why do they refuse to speak English? And why have my parents not taught me the language? And I started asking a number of people. I heard this story, and this is the pivotal moment for me. My grandparents saw that the children, so my mother and my aunts and uncles, were coming home from the schools in the summer not speaking Cree anymore. And they said they were becoming rude. They were not respecting the elders in the community. They were not respecting my grandparents. And that really concerned my grandmother. And so she told my grandfather, we have to stop this right now. And she made him hide the children on our trap line, so away from the community where my grandparents went trapping in the winters. They would take a few of the children at a time and hide them there. There's 15 children on my mother's side. And what my grandfather did is he re-immersed them in the language on the land. And that was a brave effort, because during that time, they could have been imprisoned, they could have been fined, or both. They risked their freedom to make sure that the language was kept alive in my family. And when I heard that story, I felt so much shame, because I was not able to speak to them in this language that they fought so hard to save. And I felt a great deal of sadness because as a grandchild, they could see the language starting to disintegrate in my generation because none of my cousins or my siblings could speak Cree anymore. The second thing that happened after that was that I kept hearing from lawyers, Canadian lawyers, that said that Indigenous people have no language rights in the same way that French and English do. There's no laws that protect the language rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I was furious when I heard that, because we are the first languages of the country. Our languages are we cannot go anywhere else in this world to speak the language. And our language, our relationship to the land comes from the language. Our value systems comes from the language. Our respect for our elders and the territories we live on, the language instructs us about those values and the relationship. I had been studying law, and they were right. There was no definition of language rights within our Constitution or in our charter that says explicitly that Indigenous peoples have a right to language and culture. But who cares? Our languages are the responsibility that we have to advance our language rights. It's enshrined in our Indigenous laws, in our Cree laws, in our Ojibwe laws. We talked about earlier about rights, right? And there was one panel member when they were talking about the forced sterilization of Indigenous women. We have responsibilities to transmit the language in our communities. Whether you want to talk about it in terms of rights or responsibilities, they're there. We have to make sure that that language is kept alive for our children and our grandchildren. And that's why those elders were saying that genocide has been committed against our peoples, because they took the land, and now we're starting to see the eradication of what makes us distinct, which is our language and our culture. So since that period, I have been working to advance language rights in our Constitution for Indigenous peoples. Aluki has been working so hard to advance language rights for Indigenous peoples, for Inuit people, I read about her in the papers all the time, and her work really inspires the work that we do in the South for First Nations people. So I just wanted to share that bit about my personal experience, but why I have been working to advocate for Indigenous language rights for the past 15 years.
Lorena, for sharing that with us and bringing out so powerfully to what extent the assault on language is really an assault on the most sacred relations with the people who are so close to you, how the destruction of languages really destroys the fabric of the community and the family, and how absolutely necessary it is to recover the language, as you say, to become a community again. So thank you for that. And also the way I recall one of your essays is called Redress for Linguicide, and you use, again, you make such a powerful argument for how the attack on language is absolutely a form or modality of genocide. So thank you for that. And I remember, Stan, that earlier today, you mentioned that you learned your language. It's been 18 years now, if I recall correctly. 18, and now you are a language instructor, and you, I believe you also develop an accelerated immersion program. Could you share with us what was that driving force for you? We heard from Aluki and Lorena. What was that moment or something that pushed you to learn, to recover the language?
Okay, Iipay mati Iipay cham. Moya samu nya chuhinya makupai wuskonan. Pe nya wai uyu pe nya kanap. Mamlimara nya a pesho. Uknach moya mayum nya wai chuwai. Ma haup spir. Nya cha spir. Nya po moya nya melches. Nya hiku pinai. Shuhu mapa. Mayum nya wai nyuwap. Nya wai spir. Venimos a todos, mi nombre es Stanley Rodriguez, yo soy Iipay Kumeyaay de Reserva Santa Ysabel, aquí en San Diego. Y ahorita nosotros tenemos 12 reservas indígenas aquí en San Diego y 6 más reservas indígenas en Baja California. My name is Stanley Rodriguez. I'm from the San Ysabel band of the Iipay Nation. And our people, we have 12 reservations here in the United States and another 6 in Baja California, Mexico. And our people, we have endured 3 waves of encroachment. First, the Spanish wave. We can talk about that, but that's another discussion. All I can say is the missions that came into our area, we burned them down and we turned the priests into grease spots. We still fight that. And what my son had to do was 4th grade project. We made that mission, then we burnt it and sent it so his teacher can see what we did. And also in Baja, all the missions in our territory were burned down because our people fought. Mexico, the same thing. They wanted to use the people for slave labor, create estancias. And our people fought that. Our people almost overran the Mexicans, ran them out of Old Town 3 times. The last time they used a British schooner in the bay that used its cannons to repel. But if it wasn't for the Mexican-American War, we would have probably defeated them. And then when the Mexican-American War happened, the only battle that happened in California happened in San Diego, the Battle of San Pascual. 2-day battle. The Mexicans won, but they lost the war. So when the Americans came, they had their own ideas. The Spaniards and the Mexicans wanted to use this for slave labor. Como dice, por esclaves. But over here, they had other ideas. They wanted to just annihilate our people. They did a lot of that work up north. Down south, it was more difficult because we had guns from the Mexicans. So we were a much harder target. But then they decided that they were going to make treaties. They made 18 treaties with our people. The treaty for the Kumeyaay people was the Treaty of San Ysabel, which was created January 7th, 1852. Promised us the reservations from the Mexican border all the way to Riverside County. But those reservations, those treaties were not ratified by the federal government. So since then, our people have been struggling. The boarding schools, I've had my uncles and aunts go to these boarding schools. And what they would tell the people was, your language, your culture, that's a way of the past. They had 3 categories of human beings: savage, barbarians, and civilized. Guess where we as Native people landed? Good answer, savage. What did they want us to do? Become civilized. So they would punish the people, they would do things. So a lot of people, what they did was they code switched. My aunts code switched. However, it had a delayed impact because when they came home, their younger siblings, they said, if you want to do good in school, don't speak Indian, don't speak your native language. In Baja California, they had escuela bilingües, but the Mexican teachers would go and they would tell the parents and the children, if you want to do good in school, don't speak your native language, only speak Spanish. So we had 2 hegemonic cultures that were attacking the Kumeyaay people from 2 sides. So what's happening today, of the approximately 4,623 Kumeyaay who reside on both sides of the border, there's 30 of us who still speak the language. And under the UNESCO 9 factors of language vitality and endangerment, 5 being stable, 0 being extinct, the Kumeyaay language is listed as a 1, critically endangered. So and when I was young, they did not want to teach the younger people the language. My aunts would talk to each other, and I would want to learn. And they said, "Why do you want to know?" That was a mentality from the boarding school. A lot of people acquiesced to that. I didn't. In my matao and my soul, that is important. Our language is important to us. Language and culture support each other. And I'm a singer. We were talking. I sing Kumeyaay, Wildcat, Iipay, people song, Shalok, and I sing some bird. But in those songs, they tell a story, and it's all in our language. And if you don't speak the language, you will not understand the stories. The ability to see the universe through a Kumeyaay lens is powerful. How many of you speak more than one language? Go ahead, you can raise your hands. Okay. All right. How many of you notice when you speak different language, you're looking through the universe through a different lens? And this is the problem that the United States government had with our people. What did they want to do? They wanted to assimilate the people who were left, terminate the reservations, and it would be over and done with. They wanted us to just disappear. Now, I heard earlier some people talking about how they're not resistors. Well, you know what? Our treaties were never ratified, so we don't have treaties to fall back upon. Resistance is the only other way to do it. And I'm going to tell you something. With so few people speaking the language, if we do not do something now, we're going to lose it all. So I'm going to say this to everybody. In order to regain our language, our culture, we need to get radical. We need to do something that is going to reverse language shift. How do we do that? The pedagogic systems that have been done in the past for language, and I've been around the world. I was there with Gamilla Roy. I've seen how they did it, and it patterns. Many of the other people, they teach greetings, numbers, colors, and animals, plateaus, and that's it. You are not, ladies and gentlemen, you are not going to get proficient with language just by using that. And it recycles. How many of you ever seen that? I'm sure a number of you have. The only way to gain proficiency is through immersion. And this is something that, people have been struggling with. Western schools do not teach it. They do not teach it. What do they teach? There's a battle between literacy and fluency. People want to learn how to read and write. Hey, I'm Kumeyaay. We have an oral tradition. Bringing our language back is the important thing. All of our native languages. Yeah, if we want to learn how to read and write later. But no, it does no good if we have nobody left to speak it. So this is why it's so important. So one of the things that we did is, and I'm not saying just me, I mean, there was a group of us coming together, deciding how are we going to address this issue. So we came up with a blended model for language immersion. It was a 1-month intense immersion program, 8 hours a day, actually 6 days a week. And the terminal objective is upon successful completion of the course, each participant would be able to sit down in conversation without notes in the target language for 1 hour, just using the language. So far, we've had all of our participants successfully doing that. So the thing is, we can teach, we can revitalize the language, we can teach it. The problem is sustainability, especially when you send them back to communities where there's no other speakers. The great dilemma, how do we keep it going? So these are things that are happening in Indian country today. The point I'm making, ladies and gentlemen, is our Native people, we as Native people, we have the answers to the issues that are going on. It's taking that risk, jumping out there and doing it. Because if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it. How many of you have been to the United Nations? A number of you have. Not to pick on those guys, but they do a lot of talking. If we're going to do it, we have to do it within our own communities. That's just how it is. As we say in Kumeyaay, "Payo." That's just the way it is. So thank you for letting me share a little bit. And I'm going to turn this off.
Thank you very much, Stan. And we've been hearing, and you mentioned it as well, how indigenous communities have been destroyed by, all kinds of means, physical force, murder, disease, starvation, assault on cultures. And you kind of, speak in this like idiom of like, fighting back and battling back. And it's amazing that like your weapon of choice to fight back is language, like the most powerful weapon to fight back and, against the oppressor, as we heard before, right, is language as this like absolutely like powerful tool that you have to regain what has been so like, taken away. So thank you for that. And again, as a person who kind of lives in two language worlds, I also kind of want to attest that when you live in two worlds, two language worlds, that like really enriches you, this is not an obstacle to like thriving in the world and succeeding in the world. This is actually the best way to be in the world. It enriches you. It is not dangerous to sort of be, not like an exclusive English language speaker. So I just wonder if perhaps the panelists would like to ask questions of one another before we turn it to the floor. Aluki, I hope you can hear me. I'm sitting here on the side. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that I wonder if perhaps there are any comments amongst you, or if we should turn it over to the floor.
I think I just want to make one final comment, because when we think about the destructions of Indigenous languages, we have to talk about our current school system, the dominant school system, right? The current school system continues to destroy our language and culture, because our children are learning English and French. Up in Canada, they can learn French at the expense of their own language. Right now, as Stanley said, immersion is the only way that we're going to revitalize our language. Can any of our children go to school from kindergarten to grade 12 to learn their language in an immersive way? No, we can't. So the genocide that is occurring in our communities, what I'm trying to say is that genocide is still continuing to occur in our school systems, because our kids do not come out of the school knowing their oral history, their teachings, our ceremonies. They don't know who they are when they come out of those schools. They learn European history. They learn the colonizers' history, right? They're not learning to be Kumeyaay. They're not learning to be Inuit. They're not learning to be Ojibwe or Cree. And we have immersion programs right now that do teach English and French. I think down here there's probably some Spanish immersion programs, right? We know they work. My daughter is in a French immersion program right now because I value language. It was the only alternative language program that I was able to put her in. By the time she was in grade 3, she was debating, reading, and writing in French. If she was able to be put into an Ojibwe or a Cree immersion school, she'd be fluent right now, right? Immersion programs work. And our governments do not invest in the education of our children. They do not invest in the ability for our children to reclaim their cultural identity or the language in the schools. And that is still an act of genocide, in my opinion.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to echo those words. For our people, they have tried to just wipe us off the face of the earth, and with your, and I just wanted to pick on you. You're walking away, but with okay, well, I'm just going to say real quick with. Well, I'll say this while you're walking out. You know, okay, well, no, you know, your people, the Gabrieno, the Tongva, the Kizh people, just because you're not federally recognized does not make you any less native. And you know, all these things that they did with you, they want to do to all of us. And that's why we started Kumeyaay Community College, because Western schools were not teaching our culture, our history, our language, our native epistemology, our organic sciences, fire science, water science. We were marginalized. We were discounted as a people, and we said, enough. We need to bring these things back. And that's why we started this school, working with the Kumeyaay on both sides of the border, and doing this with language, bringing it back, bringing our native scholars in to help teach our languages, to help teach our culture, to help do these things is so important, because they will not do it for us. They do not value our education. They do. To us, we as Native people, we value education. Our whole world is our school. Everything, like when you talk about the medicines, you know, somebody becomes an apok, an apprentice, and they learn. That's the way we learn. When I started learning the songs, I was handed that rattle, but I was married to that rattle. They said that was my first wife, and there's hundreds of songs that go with it. Each song tells a story. We weren't just given a tape and, you know, do that. We stayed up all night to do that. That was our school. And I think when we get away from that, that's when we get we get weak. But yes, our science is so important. Our language, I cannot, well, I'll tell you one last thing and I'll shut my snoot on this. How many of you have been to Standing Rock? Any of you? You were out there. We went out there too. We went out there and went out there on Christopher Columbus Day. And I'm the language teacher. My students want to go. We go, okay, we're going to do a field trip. We got over there, and we're taking food and supplies. We're going to go to the line. And there were people, the drones were flying overhead, the planes were flying. And we made an agreement. When we get there, we're not going to use English. We're just going to talk in our own language. So we did. That was our secret language. Nobody understood it. Other Native people who didn't speak their own languages came and said, how did you learn? We want what you got. So our people are hungry for it. We just need to make that space, help them, and support each other. I'm not saying I know everything, but I will share what we do, and you can share what you do, and we can all continue to grow together. We all take what we need and leave the rest. But I just want to share, and you know, when we speak our language, that is resistance. When we sing our songs, that is resistance. When we do our traditional dances and ceremonies, that is resistance. When you're doing the traditional medicines, even if it's in your car, that is resistance, because they try to wipe all that away from us. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, they try to take everything from us, our greatest revenge is our success. So I wish all of you great revenges. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Stanley. If I can just quickly ask, because you spoke about immersion and how it really works and how your daughter would have been fluent by now. And you teach at the college level. But then you also said, you used a great word, which I can't quite remember, that it has to be sustained, right? Like it has to be sustained beyond the school, because again, like I learned languages in school, I learned German and Russian, and then you leave the school and you forget if the immersion doesn't continue in the community. And Aluki was telling about how important it would have been to have signage in Inuk and to have that language in the public space. So when you talk about that sustaining the language, what would you envision?
The media, radio, TV, signs, newscasters who use both, use our target languages. I've seen it. I mean, how many of you have been to New Zealand and you see them do it in Maori? How many of you gone to Hawaii and you see them do it over there? How many of you ever seen native groups from Oaxaca having their radio stations in the language? Other things. All these help. All these assist. Because that's what they're doing in English or Spanish. And that's why our people are losing. You know what? Our people, they say, oh, no, you only speak English, that way you learn. You never learn English anyway. I mean, they speak it all over the place. It's our languages that, is important for us to not make effort, but to actually do it. Some people call language immersion pods. Some people say language mills. When we come together as a group using the language, using it over and over. That's all I have to say about that.
Can we use the mic? Yes.
For questions, we need to use the mic so you can hear, but it looks like earlier.
Aluki, was there something you wanted to respond to either Lorena or Stan?
I have missed some of the discussion when people don't put their microphones on, but I would say that in addition to the list of ways of resistance that Stanley mentioned, I think the mere existence of being an Indigenous person who's alive and breathing is resistance. Regardless of what we do, it's resistance because, as Lorena was explaining, there's been systematic approaches to try and eradicate us. And I think in Canada, in terms of our language, the violent, calculated, proactive approaches through residential schools that were fully funded by the Canadian government, that meant that personnel and resources were allocated to try and eradicate Indigenous children and destroy our societies, is certainly an example of violence against Indigenous peoples in terms of language. I think in terms of resistance, in my part of the world, young Inuit at the age of 19, at 24, got together because they were the first generation of bilingual Inuktitut-speaking, English-speaking individuals, got together to start advocating for the creation of the territory of Nunavut. And over a period of 30 years, were able to change the map of Canada, all peacefully, but through the sheer persistence of needing to have a territory where, as Inuit, we're the public majority. And the expectation was that in 1990, for example, the Tunngavik Federation of Nunavut President Paul Kwasa, at the signing of the agreement in principle when I was 15 in the audience, stated that he, as the president, on behalf of Inuit, was asserting our right to speak Inuktitut, asserting our right to have an education in Inuktitut. The thing is that what is very tragic, I think, and continues to be a point of frustration, is that although as Inuit were the public majority homogeneously in the territory of Nunavut, which is different and unique than all other jurisdictions across Canada, is that the Canadian government in 1990, although they were signing on to an agreement in principle in the expectation to create a new territory of Nunavut, they had cabinet documents that we are now able to see where they deliberately, consciously made this decision not to fully fund education in Inuktitut. So we're in a territory that, although we're the public majority, we cannot expect to receive education in the formal education system from kindergarten to grade 12 in Inuktitut. And in fact, the vast majority, although more than 90% of the student population are Inuit who speak Inuktitut, the vast majority, about 75% of the teachers, are unilingual English-speaking teachers that have been imported into our territory. So the reality is that a grade 5 Inuk student who speaks Inuktitut at home continues to this day, continues to go into the school where they are expected to strip who they are and speak a language that is not their own mother tongue, and work receive a formal education with curriculum that is created outside the Inuit culture and Inuit worldview. And so those continue, in my view, to be very concrete ways of trying to continue with the work of eradicating who we are. In fact, to this day, the Canadian government, when they have language agreements with our territorial public government, provides an amount of the amount of $8,189 per francophone person, compared to $186 per Inuktitut speaking person. So in other words, that means Inuktitut language, French language speakers receive 44 times that of Inuktitut language speakers. So that's another very concrete way in which genocide and cultural assimilation continues to exist in our territory. And so as a person who's in this elected position advocating for Inuit, in anticipation of 2019, the Indigenous Languages Year, we had asked Tongavik, Nub, Kangas, Robert Phillipson, and Robert Dunbar to do a study for us. And it was entitled, Is Nunavut Education Criminally Inadequate? An analysis of current policies for Inuktitut and English in education, international and national law, linguistic and cultural genocide, and crimes against humanity. And we were able to release that in 2019 with the hopes that it would create more awareness about how assimilation and genocide continues to happen in Canada. And I think it was crucial to point that out, because often those are thought of as a historic chapter of Canada, especially when people are talking about residential schools. And so in 2020, I also sent a letter including a package of all the reasons why Inuit are not the rights of Inuit are not being upheld according to international instruments, national laws, territorial laws. When I wrote a letter to the Special Rapporteur on minority issues, outlining how Inuit expect and need to, that it's a life and death situation, that Inuit need to be able to receive health services, for instance, in Inuktitut, justice services in Inuktitut, education services in Inuktitut. And I think what's really frustrating is that we know that Inuktitut is declining at 10% per decade. So if we do absolutely nothing, even though our language continues as right now a strong language, comparatively speaking to other indigenous languages, and I think we're second to the Cree language in Canada, we know that by 2051,
Their languages will be endangered.
we do nothing. That only reason about is that, as Lorena pointed out, we have nowhere else to go if our languages die. And so that is really concerning. And the last point I wanted to make is that as Inuit, we're not sitting around waiting for things to happen. I think we were very visionary in trying to create a territory where we would be the public majority. But recently, on October 13, 2021, I walked over to the Nunavut Court of Justice and filed a motion against the territorial government in relation to the education system and claim that the territorial government was denying equality rights and perpetuating systematic discrimination by forcing Inuit children to continue in the education system that is primarily English, and that they're denying the ability for us to get a formal education in our own language and culture. And extremely disappointingly, the government of Nunavut on April 4th, instead of filing a statement of claim, instead filed a statement of a strike to release. And they indicated that the only language education rights in Canada belong to English and French speaking people under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, and that as Inuit, we do not have a right to language within education. And so that's where we're currently at in our territory. And I will say that as a person who lives in Apex, which is just outside of the capital in Iqaluit, each day I drive from where I live into the city for work, and I drive by a French school that is being renovated. And in 2020, the Canadian minister had allocated $10,769,000 to expand the one French school in the territory of Nunavut, because French is a recognized language. And at the time, Minister Joly was quoted as saying, all Canadians have the right to a quality education in their first and second language, regardless of the community to which they belong. But as Inuit, as Inuktitut speaking Inuit, we knew that meant only if you're a French speaker or only if you're an English speaker. Because as Inuktitut speaking Canadians, our rights are not as important or equal to that of French or English speakers. Thank you for letting me say that.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you so much. I think we had a question from the floor.
Iipay. Iipay, I just want to ask Dr. Rodriguez about his work in immersion. And I think throughout the years that I've seen you work with language in your community, as well as with other communities, and also in Arizona. And I've always been intrigued by the immersion framework, and I wanted to see if you could discuss that a little bit more. And also, how long have you been doing immersion work?
In my experiences so far, immersion works, and the way it's set up is like how we learn a language. We're not born with a pen and paper. We don't learn sentence structure. We learn it by listening and mimicking and going through it. When we teach situational fluency, we'll teach whole sentences. And when people say, well, break it down, don't worry about breaking it down. You'll learn it as you go. This is how the elders wanted it. One of the things they said, if you want to break it down, you do that later on. But right now, you're going to learn the way we learned. Shut up, listen, learn it, and do it. So it was all about using it in conversation. That is a big thing. And many people get uncomfortable. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to word. I'm worried about saying it incorrectly. And I tell the students, don't worry. Boom, boom. You are going to brutalize the language. You are going to say it incorrectly. I'm going to laugh at you. They laughed at me. But every time you do it, you're going to get better and better and better. And I've been doing this since the early 2000s. And one of the things that the elders told me was they did not want the language to die out. They regretted that they did not teach the next generation. And they were hoping that we could generate speakers. And one thing I learned is that children learn best from other children. To them, we're fossils. They want to learn from other children because those are the people they interact with. So the target is to eventually get a group of children to become proficient with the language and start pulling in maybe groups of 5 to 10 at a time, develop and develop and develop and continue to grow and start spreading this into other and be supportive of each other. One of the problems we're running up with is dialect differences. How many of you ever noticed different dialects out there? It doesn't mean that you can't speak with a person. How many of you speak Spanish? Anybody? You speak? Where are you from? Bolivia. ¿Y usted habla igual como yo? Poco diferente, pero entiende. Okay, so I asked, do I speak the same? She goes, no, it's a little bit different, but we can understand. Same thing with our native languages. Same thing. Some people get wrapped around the axle about it. But language immersion does work, but it's getting people out of the Western mindset. I guess that's what it comes down to. And we can do it with our own people. And if we wait for funding, you know what? We'll have no more speakers left. It has to be a grassroots thing. I mean, bringing in your own kids, your grandkids, sitting them down, families coming together, using it. And it can't be 1 hour a week. I would say it has to be at least 15 to 20 hours a week for it to have any effects. I would prefer 40 hours a week. So that's all I have to say about one last thing I just want to say, and then I'm going to shut up about this. You know, when we talk about the things that have happened to our people, I hear about the genocide, I hear about all these things, and we all have stories that brings tears to each other. However, we are alive today. We are the products of attempted genocide. We are the ones who have survived. The matao, the spirits of our ancestors, are with us right now. And we say our culture, the Kumeyaay people, we were one of the few peoples in California that made pottery. And we say that all of our culture, everything, our spirituality, everything was like in a great clay pot that was shattered on rocks by 3 waves of encroachment. How many of you ever worked with pottery? Anybody? You have? Well, one time I made a pot, put it in the fire traditionally, and it exploded. And I looked at it and went, what a waste. And one of the elders, she was watching. She said, go get those pieces. Got them, and she ground them up. She said, get new clay, and ground it up. That pot, that broken pot, was a temper. She said, that was our past. Now we're putting it in with the present. Now you're going to make a new pot. and it will withstand the firing. And it did. So the things are our spirituality, who we are from our past, it's with us today. But if we incorporate with us and what we're learning, we're going to make a strong vessel for our future. So I just want to share that. Thank you. Oh, and I did have it on. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a follow-up question, please.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. I also work with language and teaching the Dene language at the University of Arizona. And I just want to commend you for doing your work. And I think as native speakers, fluent speakers, you're also a knowledge holder, a cultural knowledge holder. And so thank you for your work.
Hello. I just want to acknowledge, Stan, thank you for bringing up essentially the humility that has to come out in terms of learning something new that colonization has tried so hard to squander. I find that, like, I'm a former classroom teacher for elementary and middle school, and I find that it's not just in language in general, but there's something to be said for colonizer energy around ignorance and the immediate defense that comes up around not knowing something. And I think for Indigenous people, and regardless of where you are in Turtle Island, even if it's not necessarily a part of your teachings, humility is a natural, it's a part of parenthood. It's a part of life to not know. We come into this world not knowing past what our biology tells us. So yeah, I think that's so critical. And that too is a part of the intimate, but also trauma realities in terms of learning language and reconnecting with the land. It's like the land itself has this humility that we've also, to a certain extent, forgotten by adapting to the colonizer language.
Okay, so the question from Zoom is, how can we relatives all support each other in this? For example, how do we support you, Aluki, and support Inuktitut language immersion and rights in education? Stan, how do communities all over the world support Kumeyaay language immersion?
The community support Kumeyaay language immersion. I'll take it a step further. How can we support each other in our work towards reversing language shift? Sharing how we do things. We can all learn from each other. I'm not saying I have, all the answers for anything. I mean, it's a group of us coming together and we decide we're going to do this and we do it. So working together is a big thing. And knowing the struggles we have, going to Australia and seeing, what works and what doesn't work for them. Those are incredible things. Going to Hawaii, they have an incredible school over there. However, they have the numbers to support that. We only have 4,623 people, and that's on both sides of the border. So some things will work, other things that, we're going to do. And what happens with people who have no speakers? How can we support them in revitalizing their language, reviving a language that is dormant? So, in other words, all of us coming together, working together, we can help each other to grow. That makes any sense?
Aluki, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Well, I think part of the challenge in Canada is I think part of the solution, I should say, is raising awareness about the richness of different worldviews expressed through different languages. And if more mainstream Canadians, for instance, started understanding that deeply and had an appreciation for Indigenous languages, presumably they would also mean that they vote for people who make up the Canadian government politicians who make decisions on legislation that would be more supportive of Indigenous languages. I say that because I know that there was a question in the chat about whether or not the Canadian legislation that was passed in 2019, the Indigenous Languages Act, was sufficient compared to the Official Languages Act. And the great difference there, in my view, is that Section 10.1 of the Indigenous Languages Act speaks about essential public services, or speaks about government services, and says that Indigenous languages will be used where the government has the capacity to provide that service in an Indigenous language and where there's a demand. In comparison, the Official Languages Act of Canada, which speaks to French and English, requires in Section 22.b, requires that the government provides the service in either of those official languages where there is a significant demand. And so we find ourselves in Nunavut where we have a significant demand. But because the government doesn't have the capacity, there's no way of us to expect that we will be able to get that service. And so I think having more non-Indigenous people and more Indigenous people, having all of us talk about the importance of Indigenous languages and the richness it contributes to the globe would help us so that governments would then be more open and willing to support the vitality in our languages. And I will say that as Inuit, I mean, I talked a little bit about what we've been doing to try and get a territory, to go to court, to get reports commissioned, but we've also financially committed, for instance, $6.7 million over a 6-year period to a center in our capital that focuses on providing Inuktitut immersion programs for Inuktitut or for people who already speak Inuktitut but want to increase their proficiency in different areas and specializations, as well as for Inuit who may not speak Inuktitut but want to learn Inuktitut, as well as Inuktitut speaking Inuit who want to become instructors. So, I mean, that's one example. We have several where we've put financial commitments in relation to the importance of making sure our language continues to thrive, because we can't only wait for government. And I think this is in line with what Stanley was saying, is that it is actually up to us, but certainly we need allyship to bring it to the mainstream kind of discussion and support.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And it's a really amazing dynamic between the voices on this panel, because it seems, Aluki, that the question of revitalizing language is not just a cultural question, it's a profoundly political question. And that's why you are asking for like legal instruments that will actually have teeth, rather than, as in written into the Constitution, because like Section 35 of the Constitution does not guarantee that at all right now. And then on the other hand, what you were saying, Stan, the grassroots movements to revitalize languages. And I think now we can see how the two are like really complementary and powerful together. So thank you for that. And I think perhaps we will have, do we have any questions from the floor? We do have some on Zoom in the chat. So perhaps 2 questions from the chat, and we will have to wind it down, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'm going to ask them both together, and then panelists can respond how they wish. So the first question is from Michael Odegaard. For all panelists, why is it important to guarantee public services in the Indigenous language regardless of English language proficiency? So that's the first question. And then from Sam Beltram, Are there any language preservation collaborations that people can contact to get connected to language immersion programs for their respective tribes? For example, I am seeking resources to reconnect with my Uta language. I don't know if it's Uta or Ute language. I yearn to learn Ute from native Ute speakers.
I think we also have a third question from Rebecca, so perhaps we can add that to the roster and then ask the panelists to combine their answers.
I want to thank each of you for those amazing and very powerful and insightful presentations. And I guess I just had a simple question that I was wondering, because what you're talking about is really inclusion of Indigenous nations into the structure in a way that makes sense. So the government services should be available to native language citizens, right? I mean, they're citizens, but they are, you know, living in communities with that language. And Dr. Rodriguez, you're a president of a tribal college, which is an institution that is equivalent in a lot of ways to, you know, other colleges and universities, but it has a specific mission that's driven by your nation. And so I'm just wondering, like, can the tribal colleges and tribal governments sort of come together in a way that makes that more available, I guess, to communities? Because right now I think governments just look at it and say, oh, where are we going to find somebody who speaks that? I mean, it takes a lot even to teach Navajo at the University of Arizona, and there's so many Navajo people at our school. So I can't even imagine if there's 30 language learners or something. Like, what is the structural thing, and what is the role of tribal colleges, I guess, in that? But I really commend all of you for the work you're doing.
We have 3 questions on the floor, so would one of you like to begin?
I'll start if you're okay.
I'll answer that. And do you hear me? What happened? Oh, was she talking? No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, sorry about that. I was just going to jump in and say I'll make a response about the essential public services, and then I'll be quiet for the rest of the time. But in terms of why it's important, regardless of proficiency, I think there's different levels of proficiency, and I think sometimes people, I mean, in our territory, sometimes people assume Inuit can understand English well because that's their point of view. That's where they sit in the world, and English is their own language. And so in the healthcare system, for instance, if you're going through a extremely worrying, life-changing moment where you're panicked and you're thinking, I'm hearing this information from a doctor in English and it means something about my life that might alter my life, it makes sense that you would start. And I know this for a fact that one of a person that I know stopped communicating in English. Their first instinct was to communicate in Inuk, because they were so shocked about the information that was being shared with them. And so I think it's really important that Inuit are able to access services in health in that instance. But I'm also aware where a young Inuk man was shot by the police and died, and the father was saying, if you had spoken Inuk to them, because as some of the panelists were talking about, different languages convey different points of view and worldviews. And so the father was saying, if you had spoken to him in Inuktitut, it would have been able to bring down this very high tense moment, and he wouldn't have had to be shot, you know? And so that's why I say it's a life and death situation the inability to service us in Inuktitut. And there are so many examples in the health field, even in education. Often there's statistics about us Inuit saying there's such a high dropout rate with no consideration that the system is set up to push us out. And so, in fact, it's not a dropout rate because we're inadequate as Inuit and incompetent in our ability to have a formal education. It's a push out rate because our language is not being used. Our culture is not the basis for the curriculum or the materials and resources. And so the way it should be conveyed in data is that it's a push out rate rather than a dropout rate, right? And I think, I would say, and I would encourage different areas of society to start questioning how we accept so many of the narratives about us as Indigenous peoples. And we need to push back and say, well, actually, when you look at it this way, or if you use an Indigenous worldview, this is how you would interpret it. And I think there's so much strength and value in our languages. And I think we can use that as a way to strengthen and achieve more harmony, societal harmony in our communities that are so often rampant with social strife. So I think we can use our languages on so many fronts. Thank you.
Would anyone like to add?
I just want to say, as far as education, Kumeyaay Community College was created in order to address the education needs of our reservations because of problems that we're having. Tribal youth were going to continuation school. They were calling it the Indian school, the continuation school, because almost all of them were natives from Campo, Manzanillo, La Posta, and we wanted to change that narrative. So the board of trustees for Kumeyaay Community College are representatives from each one of the reservations. So we have buy-in from the reservations. We're also working with our counterparts in Baja and working to develop a sister institution with the UABC, Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, to work with them over there. So this is something that is really important for us. And our classes, we have them for credit. They're transferable into the Cal State and UC system, and it's open to Kumeyaay and non-Kumeyaay. So we have quite a few non-Kumeyays coming, taking the classes and learning, doing these things. And on the other part, Ms. Beltran was asking about any other organizations. One that comes to mind is ICLS, Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival, which is here up in Berkeley, and they do work with master apprentice programs, things like that. And the last thing, is educating the people. Last story I'm going to tell tonight, I was on the phone talking to my aunt in a grocery store. I was talking to her in Kumeyaay, and then somebody patted me on the shoulder. And I turned and it was an old white woman. And I said, yes, can I help you? And she pointed at the American flag. She said, excuse me. I said, yes. She goes, you're in America? You need to talk American? Well, the next thing that came out of my mouth, I basically gave her a verbal enema. And after I was done with her, she said, I was just trying to help. So a lot of it is, that's how she looks after I was done with her. But, a lot of that is we are re-educating people. Because when you only speak one language, and if you don't speak your own Indigenous language, because we're all Indigenous from somewhere, if you don't speak your Indigenous language, you're dying inside. You're dying inside. Your matau, your spirit is dying inside. You just don't know it. We know it because we're struggling with it every day. But when we revitalize it, that is power. You can feel it in us. So when we talk about working together with groups, it's not to build an atmosphere of tolerance, because tolerance is a negative term. I tolerate this mosquito bite or this inclement weather, but build an atmosphere of celebration of the diversity. And we can all learn from each other and we can all grow together. So now I'll turn this off.
Lorena, would you like to offer a concluding remark?
I think, so I'm speaking from a place where language is endangered. Aluki is speaking from a place where the language is the majority, right? So for us in the southern part of Canada, our goal is to advance language rights to education. Until we can get to the point where we are the majority of the speakers in the country, or even the majority of speakers on our own territories, public service or having services in our language, that is a goal to aspire to, right? But right now, our focus for language revitalization effort is in immersion programs, is in education. We have students that are demanding across the country at universities for language programs at the university level because they want to learn their language. And the only place they can go right now are to schools, post-secondary, K-12. So our ability to be able to offer language programs that will allow for students to become proficient, eventually, hopefully fluent, that is our dream in the South. The longer term goal is to see our communities speaking the language within government, right? That our language use is evident within, not only in the schools, but in our government, in our tribal, in our First Nations, in our Indigenous governing systems, so that when we are doing business with each other, that we're using our language. And when we get to that point, that is when we can say that our languages are sustainable.
Well, I believe we will thank our panelists for not only what you've said today, but for your commitment and perseverance and passion despite the sadness and frustration on so many occasions, and the work that, you know, is really world restoring and world making and celebratory, as you said, Stan. So thank you very much. Thank you. Aluki, thank you for joining us from Nunavut, Tunngavik. Thank you.